Hello, my name is Jacob Schoeneman, and today I will be interviewing my grandpa, retired Captain Robert Schoeneman, who was a police officer for 32 years, a professor of criminal justice at Camden County College, and served in the U.S. Army in the 1970s. The purpose of the interview is to get his perspective on some of the events he lived through that were significant historical events in the United States history that had a lasting impact on the history of the United States. So what was the first major event major historical event that you can remember in your lifetime?
Well, I remember this very much so because I was a little boy. I was 9, almost 10 years old, and my mother was kind of like a worrywart, and I remember her saying prayers. We were a Catholic family, and I asked my mother what was the matter, and she really didn't want to tell me, but I knew something was wrong. So I asked my older brother, why is Mom upset? And he says, what's the matter with you, you dummy? Don't you know we're getting ready to go to World War III? And I really got scared. I was only a 9-year-old kid. And when my older brother told me we were getting ready to go to World War III, I started, getting upset. And so I went in and asked my mother, why was she upset? Are we going to go to war now? Because my father had fought in World War II in the South Pacific with all 3 of my uncles, his 3 brothers. They were all in World War II. My father helped liberate the Philippines and some of the islands that the Japanese controlled during World War II. So as a little boy, and my dad never really wanted to talk too much about the war to his kids, so I was really worried that it was going to be World War III, but I didn't know what was going on. And then my mother told me that tonight, President Kennedy, who she loved, and so many of us did because we were an old Irish Catholic family, and Kennedys were too. Of course, we weren't in their class of monetary value that the Kennedys were in. We were just a middle-class family. But the bottom line was I was really worried about that we were going to go to World War III. And that night she said that Kennedy was going to give a speech. And
that was on October 22nd of 1962, right? That was the day he gave his speech, right?
Yeah, I believe. I don't remember the exact.
So, did you find out about the Cuban Missile Crisis before Kennedy's speech or after it?
I actually found out the night of the speech, but apparently it had been going on for a few days. Kennedy had quarantined the island. It's really a naval blockade, but he called it a quarantine. He was trying to downplay it as much as he could. But at least Kennedy had the guts to confront Khrushchev because they were putting missiles in Cuba. So the bottom line was, as a little kid, I'm trying to give you my perspective. And the first I heard of it was the night that he came on TV and gave a speech. But it had been a few days before that it had been the build-up.
Yeah, it was discovered on October 16th.
Right, and I wasn't aware of it initially. I think the parents of little kids tried to shelter them as much as possible, but it was out by that point. And
so did you think there was going to be a third world war, or because of that, or before it happened, did you think that as well?
Well, I remember being in Catholic grammar school, and the nuns would have us pray a lot about.
You guys would have to go under the desks, right?
In
case of a nuclear weapon.
Yes. Do you believe that? They had, I'm sure you've seen some of the fallout shelter signs.
Yeah.
And we actually, in our Catholic grammar school, this is in the late 50s and early 60s, we actually had to go down into what was the basement of the Catholic school and get down on your hands and knees underneath tables and put your head between your legs, believe it or not, and put your hands over your head and kneel down because they actually they were called air raid drills. It was for a possibility of either airplanes dropping bombs or a nuclear holocaust.
So did you start doing that after the Cuban Missile Crisis or before?
No, definitely before. We practiced, just like they have fire drills in schools now.
Yeah.
They had both fire and air raid drills.
Because obviously the Cold War started after World War II. So, and you were kind of growing up, or you were born in the early 50s, right when it was kind of starting and ramping up. And like throughout your childhood, was it always like as
scary?
Like, I'm trying to think of a word, like as like major as it was at the point at Cuban Missile Crisis, or was it slowly building up over time to become a bigger issue?
It really, it slowly built up. I was born in 1952, so obviously I don't remember the early 50s. I was a baby, but the late 50s, I remember as a child, like 7, 8 years old, like 1959, 60-ish. Yeah, that was part of the Cold War buildup, but the ultimate for the Cold War was this tremendous stalemate between Russia and the United States. Actually, it wasn't Russia; it was the Soviet Union back then. But yes, that was the epitome of the Cold War. That was the high point.
So the Cuban Missile Crisis ended on October 28th, which was your 10th birthday of 1962. During that 6-day span, did it feel like the world was going to come to an end? Or
yeah, I was very scared because so was everybody else. Because then the kids started talking about it in school, and everybody was worried, and the nuns had us praying and all because they actually thought that there was a possibility that there was going to be a nuclear war. Fortunately, there wasn't. Huh?
I don't know.
You're laughing, but it sounded like a basketball rim. Seriously, what? Is Leah home? No. Look at that noise.
I don't know.
You can't find it?
No, I can.
Is that a basketball I hear? You hear like a jerk?
Yeah, it's probably the kids back there. Or out front. Oh my God.
No luck.
All right, let's go.
Did you find it?
The story I was gonna say.
Well, where are you at?
We were. Do you remember Black Saturday?
Do you know what the date was?
October 27th, the day before the crisis ended.
I don't really remember the 27th. I remember my birthday celebrating because the Cuban Missile Crisis ended on my birthday. What happened on the 27th?
Because a U.S. spy plane was shot down flying over Cuba, and also during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a submarine captain for the USSR that thought World War III had begun, and he ordered to drop a nuclear torpedo at a U.S. Navy base, and it had to be confirmed by 3 different Russian officials, and the 2 of the guys confirmed it, but one of them didn't confirm it, saving U.S. and Russia and such the USSR from going to war and possibly preventing World War III.
Well, that's how close it was to World War III, and you're right. But the next day was everybody breathed a big sigh of relief, because on my birthday, my 10th birthday, was not only a happy time because I was a little kid, celebrating a birthday, but my 10th birthday also was the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so it was a good day.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, a little over a year later, JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. What do you remember from that day?
I remember that weekend like it was yesterday. I really do. There's not a lot that you remember from when you're 11 years old. But I definitely, it's just like 9/11. If you ask anyone, they'll tell you where they were. They remember because other people that were alive during World War II and how we got involved when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. In December of 1941, people know exactly where they were because they were an unbelievable major event in your life. 9/11, Pearl Harbor, John Kennedy being assassinated. So yes, I was only 11 years old, but I specifically remember I was in 5th grade. I was in Sister Anita's class in Catholic school, and at around 1:45, maybe 10 minutes before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I remember it was a Friday afternoon, November 22nd, 1963. I was 11 years old in Catholic grammar school. An announcement came over the loudspeaker from the Monsignor, and it said that he wanted everyone to pray that John Kennedy, our president, had just been shot. He did not say that he died. He didn't even mention the word assassination. He just said that he had been shot.
When you guys heard that he was shot, did you guys think he was dead, or did you think there was hope for him?
At that time, we thought maybe that he was alive, and we had no idea. As a little kid, I don't want to make it too dramatic, but as a little kid, we just heard that he was shot and everybody gasped and all. And then the Monsignor had said, please, everyone pray for the president. And because I was in Catholic school, a religious school, of course, we all had to say prayers right then, which was led by our nun. And then I did not hear any more about it other than, the president had been shot, and that was between 1:45 and 2 p.m., and school got out a little bit before 3. So within the next hour, we didn't hear anything more until I got home.
So what happened when you got home from school?
When I got home from school, my mother had the TV on. She was watching it, and she was crying. And I said to her, what happened? And she goes, didn't you hear? And I said, yes, I heard that President Kennedy was shot. And then she hugged me, and she was crying. She said he died. They just announced it. I forget exactly what time it was, but it took us a while to get home. It might have been another 45 minutes went by or whatever. But the news had just broken late in the afternoon that John Kennedy, the president, had died.
So since it was on a Friday and it was on November 22nd, 1963, what was that weekend like for you right after John F. Kennedy was assassinated?
Well, I can tell you, it seemed like everything was in slow motion that weekend because, when my father got home from work, it was almost like a family member passed away because everybody was gathered in front of the television set, watching world news tonight. It might have been Walter Cronkite or whoever was the main, like today you have David Muir on Channel 6. Walter Cronkite was one of the main announcers when I was a little kid on the world news, and obviously everything was all about the assassination. And they started saying who the suspect was and that this police officer from Dallas had caught the guy, that his name was Lee Harvey Oswald. All of this was on the news, and he had killed another police officer. He shot and killed one Dallas police officer, and another one he was apprehended, I believe, in a movie theater where he ran to after he had shot Kennedy from a book repository where he was up, like, I forget what floor, but he was elevated in the building.
Did your parents like JFK, and did they end up voting for him in the 1960 election?
Yeah, they did. In those days, my dad was definitely a Democrat. My mom would go back and forth, but my dad was a big union guy. But not only was he a Democrat, but both of them voted for John Kennedy. Part of the reason, too, I'll be honest with you, is ethnicity. He was an Irish Catholic, and my mom and dad were both Irish Catholics, and a little German in there, but mainly Irish. So, of course, they voted, and we never had a Catholic priest. We never had a Catholic president before. And it was a close election, but he beat Richard Nixon.
Did anything else happen over that weekend that you can remember?
Oh, yeah. Everybody, all the family, they watched TV the whole weekend because it was very sad, and, it's so unusual, and it just doesn't happen every day that a president is assassinated. So we were glued to the TV, and ironically, you're not going to believe this, but I actually saw, like I told you, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, and they had him in the Dallas precinct, the police headquarters. And on Sunday morning, I remember my father yelling, "Did you see that?" And it was just me and him. I don't know if my mom was taking a shower, my brothers or sisters. I just remember me and my dad sitting in the living room at about 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And apparently they moved Oswald from one part of the police department to the other. And they were walking down a long corridor. And a guy named Jack Ruby all of a sudden pulled a gun out, a handgun, in police headquarters, which is so unusual that he even was in the building. But things weren't quite as secure as they are today, even though you should never have had a gun.
Did you see it live on TV?
Yes, my father yelled. I remember the incident. I can't say.
So you actually saw him getting shot on TV?
Well,
your dad.
My dad saw him, and I was sitting next to him, and he goes, "Oh my God, did you see that?" And then I did see him falling to the floor, and officers holding Lee Harvey Oswald up, and then they grabbed Jack Ruby and grabbed the gun from him. But it's amazing to be part of history, even though it was on TV. It wasn't a replay. It really happened. They were walking him through. I'm sure several million other people saw it too.
What do you remember about the Vietnam War?
Well, obviously, I was very lucky because they don't have a draft today, and they had a draft for anyone who was 18, a male 18 years or older. I know everyone still has to register for the draft, but there is no draft. It's kind of weird. I come from a big family with seven of us. I have 6 other siblings. There's 7 of us. My brother was 10 years older than me. He was at the top of the pecking order, and I was at the bottom. And he got drafted towards the beginning of the war for Vietnam, and my brother quickly wanted to get into a specialized unit, so he became a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne, jumping out of airplanes. For me, I was drafted at the very end. I was a member of the very last draft class. And I'll never forget, because they would put all these numbers into a big machine and kick them out. And all my friends and cousins and all, they all had real high numbers. Imagine having number 1 through 365, because obviously there's 365 days in a year. So they had these numbers 1 through 365, and I always cuss and say it was the only damn lottery I ever did well in. My birthday, October 28th, got picked with number 10, and the first 65 were slated. I say slated because I'm going to tell you I got very lucky. The first 65 were slated to go to Vietnam. Now, I got drafted and I was sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky for my basic training.
Was this in 1970?
This was in January of 1972. My brother got drafted 8 years earlier in 64.
So how did you actually feel about the Vietnam War, and were you for or against it?
Well, it's a good question, Jake. It was a very weird dynamic because I got drafted, and as I was telling you, I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky for my basic training, and then they call advanced individual training. I had all that, and I was getting set to go to Vietnam, and they started de-escalating the war and not sending infantry over there that were drafted. They were still bombing Vietnam. The Air Force and Navy were still bombing, and there were still soldiers on the ground, but they were slowly withdrawing them because of all the anti-war protesting going on in the country. And like I said, it was a weird dynamic because I had so many of my friends, long-haired hippies, and, you can call them whatever you want, but a lot of these people were your friends and family. Like, it was weird because I wanted to serve my country honorably just because I got drafted. But on the same token, I knew what they were feeling because I didn't want to go there. And a lot of people thought it really wasn't our war, and why are we over in Vietnam? They weren't the aggressor. But yet with Nixon and all, we were there to stop the advance of communism. It was really a weird time in American culture. The 60s were very turbulent, and the early 70s. All the people that I went to high school with, most of them were protesting the war. They were out marching with signs and all, anti-war demonstrations, and the civil rights movement was in its heyday because black people had been offended for years, and mistreated, as we know. And the Civil Rights Bill under Johnson was finally getting passed in the mid-'60s. And the country was, going through desegregation down south. You had all your incidents, and there were riots in cities. It was a crazy time growing up in the 60s. But that was kind of my story, and I got very lucky that I ended up not really having to go to Vietnam. I ended up serving in the Army for my time that I had to be there. And then of course, I used the GI Bill to get my education, and it was a different time, Jake.
I know a quote that you love to say, "Go with God" and George McGovern. Can you explain why you always say that?
Yeah, it was kind of a catchphrase for some of the young people. Go with God and George McGovern. George McGovern actually ran against Nixon. Him and a guy named Sergeant Shriver, that was his running mate. And the only state that they won, I believe, I'll have to look it up, but I think they won Massachusetts. He didn't even win his home state. Nixon swept him in the election, and a lot of young people wanted McGovern to win, but he was really an unknown, and he was a Democrat, and for some reason, because they blamed Johnson for escalating the war, and he was a Democrat, but Nixon continued the bombing and all too. So it's hard to blame one president or the other, or it was just a time during American politics that things were in upheaval. And then the weird part was, like you said, why did me and a lot of people say go with God and George McGovern? It was simply because McGovern was promising that he would end the war within 60 days of him taking office.
And I'm assuming you voted for him, right?
I did vote for him, and of course, it was a wasted vote, but in my heart, I was right. He wanted to end the war quicker because it continued for a couple more years. The last soldier was finally out of Vietnam in 75, and like I told you, I served during 72, 73. So they really started de-escalating the infantry other than the guys that were already there, and the bombing continued, but I was very fortunate.
Another big issue in the 1960s was the civil rights movement, and there was a lot going on with that. So I was wondering what you saw of it from your own eyes in the 1960s, especially growing up north in New Jersey instead of down south, and how it was different up here than it was down south.
Absolutely. As we already discussed, I went through some of the early 60 issues. The Kennedy assassination, we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a lot of the civil rights issues came up. It affected everyone in the country. There were riots everywhere. Newark, New Jersey, Detroit, they were burning. It all started back in 65 during Watts. Blacks were discriminated against for many, many years, and they took to the streets. And President Johnson, who, after the assassination of John Kennedy, President Johnson pushed through most of the bills that...
He passed the Civil Rights Act.
That's correct. And there were a lot of people that were against it, and it was a turbulent time, and the demonstrations, the people were looting and rioting, like I said, Newark, New Jersey, Detroit, even in South Jersey most of those were in the late 60s, but I even remember Camden, they burnt 3 blocks of Broadway, lots of stores, and Camden was shut down, like the center city, Camden, across the river from Philly, was shut down for several weeks. When I was a teenager, I remember that specifically, because you got to remember, April 4th, 1968, you had the assassination of Martin Luther King.
What do you remember from Martin Luther King's assassination? Like, how do you remember, or like, how did you hear about the news?
It was shocking and scary because all that was going on, and everyone had their opinion of him. My opinion of Martin Luther King, of course, over the years has changed somewhat, but always felt comfortable with him because he was a man of peace. He wasn't out to.
He wasn't like Malcolm X.
That's correct. He said that through peace you would. The peaceful demonstrations. He never exhorted violence in any way, and he believed that by massive numbers and peaceful demonstrations, you would get your point across. But in no way. And then what happened? He dies a violent death. He gets killed in April of '68, and just a couple months later, in June of '68, Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, the brother of John, gets assassinated.
He was running for president, right? Was he running against Nixon?
Well, at that point, he in '68, he was actually doing. It was a primary. He was trying to win the Democratic nomination for president.
Was he the favorite?
He was at that point. Originally, he wasn't, but there was a lot of sympathy votes because of him losing his brother and the devastation that his family went through.
Yeah.
So, and then when he got assassinated, oh my God, the country was in such turmoil because it was hard to believe that we were going through all these assassinations. But I don't know what to say as far as like personally. Yeah, it affected all of us because it was just a very turbulent time.
And who do you remember who ended up running against Nixon in '68?
I believe it was Hubert Humphrey, if I'm not mistaken, and he ended up losing to Nixon.
And then '72 was McGovern.
Yes, and McGovern ran in '72. And of course, he got trounced. He only won one state. The weird part was he promised to end the war, and Nixon did too, but Nixon had the power and they won. And then you had the whole Watergate scandal.
What do you remember of Watergate?
Watergate was bizarre because by today's standards, you don't know whether it would be scrutinized quite as much as it did back then, but it was basically they were just trying to get Nixon's people were trying to get some information, but they broke into the
on who the other side.
Opposing, the Nixon, of course, being a Republican, they were trying to get information about the Democrats to see where they stood in the election and what tactics they were using. They broke into a place. It was a Watergate hotel or whatever, and that's why it was named that. And of course, that was the beginning of the end for, as they called him, Tricky Dick. Yeah. Nixon, then him and his vice president Spiro Agnew both crashed. Meaning that was the beginning of the end, and he resigned in August.
And then Gerald Ford became president.
Right. Ford took over in '74 for Nixon, and then we went through the weird crisis in '79
with the Ayatollah.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter was president.
How did you feel about Jimmy Carter? Because he looking back, he isn't remembered as a great president.
Well, you know what's funny about Carter? I'll always remember him as a really decent human being.
He would always do what's right, but he just couldn't. He couldn't lead a country.
Well, that's what a lot of people thought, and that's what Reagan took advantage of because Carter was a man of peace, but people thought he was too much of a pacifist and he was a weak president, they felt. Yeah. And because of that, but I feel that he was a very honorable human being, and he God bless him, he lived to be 99 or 100 years old, and he led that habitat where he built those homes for years. He was a man of conviction, a good person, but he was definitely not a strong leader and a strong president. And we got into the situation with Iran, with that, as you mentioned, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and he took all those American hostages in 1979.
Mm-hmm. And then the 1980 election was Carter versus Reagan. What do you remember of that? And
well,
who did you vote for?
I voted for Reagan, and I'll tell you why. Because I felt, even though I didn't despise or hate or have any animosity towards Carter, a lot of the country felt the same way I did. They didn't want to be bullied by Iran, and to this day it's coming back to haunt us again. It's kind of weird. So everyone wanted a strong president, it seemed, because Reagan went on to defeat Carter. And this is what was really bizarre. The day, as soon as he got inaugurated on January 20th, 1980, the Ayatollah released all the prisoners.
Out of fear.
Out of fear. Yes, he knew Reagan had already promised in his pre-election bid, like when he was campaigning, that was part of his strategy. But you knew that Reagan was a man of no nonsense, and they knew it too, and they immediately released the hostages.
And then he went on to win the 1984 election as well.
Yes.
And obviously, and then after that it was Bush in 88, kind of continuing what Reagan had started. And that kind of period was towards the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And obviously we talked about the Cold War earlier and more focused on like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the peak of it, and other related things like Vietnam, which tied to the Cold War. How did you feel about where the Cold War was at in the 1980s? Did it seem like it, and like obviously, well, it did end in the early 90s, but did you see it coming towards an end in the late 80s, or did you kind of still see it as what it was in the 60s?
No, a lot of us, Reagan, Gorbachev was ironically a lot like Carter. He was a man of peace. It was the first Russian, they were still the Soviet Union until it broke apart under him, and they had all these satellite countries and all that were
in Eastern Europe.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And but Gorbachev they became Russia again instead of the USSR with all their satellite countries and all. So the Cold War simmered down.
So did you see it coming to an end?
Well, not to a total end, but I definitely would say that our relations.
Was the fear still there, or has it kind of died out by that time?
Under Gorbachev with Reagan, the fear of nuclear war had never say that it came to an end, but it definitely
died down.
It diffused and died down to the point where you weren't anxious or worried about it like you did during the 60s.
And I know Gorbachev and Reagan met in Reykjavik, Iceland, and they had a meeting about reducing like the nuclear weapons. And there was something that Reagan he said Reagan had to get rid of his I forget what the program was called. It was like Star Wars. It was something with satellites, and Reagan was against getting rid of it, but then him and Reagan and Gorbachev compromised, and he said they could keep it. And then both countries kind of started reducing their nuclear weapons, and then it kind of got to the point where it just started to kind of dissolve. And then there was the fall, of course, there was the fall of the Berlin Wall in the, I forget,
Yes.
late 80s, early 90s, and the reunification of Germany. And all the Eastern European countries becoming capitalist countries and democracies instead of communist countries. And what do you remember about like the Berlin Wall falling and the like countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia switching over to capitalism and democracy, and some new countries being created?
Yes, I remember a lot about that.
And then the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and a few years before, Reagan made his famous speech.
Yeah, he told Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, take that wall down, regarding the Berlin Wall. But it was a time, though, where after, all World War II and then all the buildup of the nuclear weapons and all, he actually did a great job, Reagan, because getting together with Mikhail Gorbachev, they actually signed that pact to dismantle thousands and thousands of U.S. and Soviet intermediate and short-range missiles.
Yeah, in 1987 they started. It was the first missile reduction treaty.
Yeah,
And
I remember that because it was a significant step.
And another big thing was that Pope John Paul was from Poland, and he was very against communism. So he played a big part in the dissolve of communism, and then obviously Gorbachev, and then the Baltic states became independent, and Germany reunited after the wall came down, and then Hungary takes down its fence between Austria, and all these Eastern European countries are becoming free from communism and becoming
independent
states.
Yep.
And then right before the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet army ordered a military coup on Gorbachev, but a lot of their soldiers refused because they were against communism and everything was falling apart, and everyone was fed up at that point. And then right before the Soviet Union fell, under Boris Yeltsin, they outlawed communism, and on December 26, 1991, the USSR had been fully dissolved, and Russia became its own country, with that being the official end to the Cold War, and all the European countries being under democracies and free of communism. One of the last things I want to touch on, which is more recent in history, it's not as far back, but is obviously 9/11 was probably one of the biggest historical events of the 21st century. And where were you that day when it happened, and how did you find out, and what was your reaction to everything going on that day on September 11th, 2001?
Yeah, it's kind of weird that you asked that. The three biggest events in this century probably were Pearl Harbor, Kennedy assassination, and 9/11. And if you ask anybody that's alive where they were when one of those three events happened, they'd probably be able to tell you exactly where they were, because they had such significant impact on every human being that was alive. So that being said, to answer your question, I was on patrol. I was a sergeant with the Cherry Hill Police Department when the news of the plane, the first plane hitting tower number 1, and when it first happened, everyone
Thought it was an accident, right?
correct. Yep.
Did you think it was an accident at first and just as some freak event?
Of course, and I would say not everyone, but I would take a guess that 90 to 95%.
And did you hear about it or see it on TV or someone told you about it or on your radio or the news?
Well, after I heard it on the radio in the police car, a lot of us headed into the police station or to the closest TV, and I pulled into a friend of mine who owned a gas station. I got out of the
Mr.
car.
Miyagi?
Yes, I went in to talk with him, and they had the TV on, and believe it or not, he said to me, "Do you believe this? A plane just crashed into the World Trade Center." I said, "I heard it on KYW News in my car, police car." And while we were talking, we actually thought it was a replay of the plane going, but it was another jet crashing into the World Trade Center number 2. That was astounding and unbelievable. We were in shock because we thought it was a replay, but it wasn't a replay. It was the terrorists killing hundreds and thousands of, not hundreds of thousands, hundreds and thousands of Americans. I think close to 3,000 people were killed in total.
And then, what did you did? All right, by that point, did you think it was a terrorist attack or?
Well, we weren't sure originally. We knew it was either terrorism or some group. You know, it was unbeknownst who it was, but it was some sort of terrorism, or was it another country that we were under attack? That's when they grounded the president. They had to ground all air. They made a decision that no planes were taking off, especially when the third one crashed into the where was it? Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. And then there was one in the Pentagon.
And the Pentagon, so that they decided to ground all the planes.
So we covered all the big events that we wanted to talk about, which was 9/11, the whole Cold War, including the Cuban Missile Crisis and the fall of Russia and the USSR, and obviously the Vietnam War, some presidencies like Reagan and Carter, as well as the civil rights and JFK's assassination. And I think we pretty much covered just about everything. So I want to say thank you for letting me interview you. And is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, it was my pleasure, you being my grandson in a U.S. history course at Rowan, and it was my pleasure. Thank you.
That's it.